The focus of this lecture is to get us moving towards thinking about youth ministry and what is youth ministry. And we'll spend a lot of time in Andy Root's book, Revisiting Relational Youth Ministry, where he will kind of unpack what does it look like theologically to think about youth ministry. But we want to begin by looking at the historical context of youth ministry. And it's important to recognize that adolescence is something that hasn't been around forever, this idea of adolescence. It's very kind of a modern phenomenon. And when we think about the rise of adolescence, we have to think about the movements of culture in the 1700s and 1800s to today. It's really a move from an agrarian society to an industrial society to a post-industrial society. And all of this leads to shift in family. So in an agricultural world, young people are needed. You have kids because you want them to work on the farm, and so they're involved in the activities of the farm. But then as you move into the industrial and post-industrial world, you end up, kids don't go to work. And so the question then becomes, well, what do we do with the children? There's a shift in social and cultural institutions. So interestingly, there's a move away from the church kind of really being the center of the community, I think, and movements more into the school, the rise of public education, and that's important in the development of the adolescent. We also have a shift in identity. So the responsibilities of young people in the agrarian world versus the responsibilities of young people today, and what are the markers of adulthood? How does one know when one is actually an adult? G. Stanley Hall is the one who first uses this term adolescence, and it comes in the late industrial period, and he defines it as a transitional period, a period of differentiation where children are differentiating themselves from their family structures, from their parents, and this can be a complex time. It can be a difficult time, and so he refers to it as a time of storm and strife. Now, as we think about the industrial and the post-industrial world and the move away from the agrarian society, what we end up with is the need for a place for young people to be. And so we get the rise of compulsory education, the rise of kind of the public school. And what this does is it begins to create this kind of extended adolescence, whereas in an agrarian society, young people very quickly need to move from being a child into doing the work of an adult. And even the markers of marriage and family life were younger. Now, this adolescent period gets extended. So when you look at the stats, the median age of marriage in the 1960s, for women it was 20, for men it was 22. 2010, the median age is 26 and 28. You can see that there's a shift happening, and I would argue that the shift is continuing. We'll talk about emergent adulthood here in a few minutes. But there's a shift that's happening where young people are putting off the traditional markers of what it means to be an adult. Many of them are staying in school longer. So when you think about graduation rates from high school, in 1900 you had 6%, 1960 73, 2012 80%, and it's higher today. This idea of staying in school or at least getting a high school diploma is just becoming a part of life. Very, very few young people are dropping out of high school anymore. Now, college is becoming a different thing, but as far as high school goes, we're seeing that there's an increased time in which young people are in school. They're also taking longer to find employment. So one of the markers of emergent adulthood is this kind of trying things out, moving from one job to the other. And this leads then to a kind of a loss of the rites and rituals of adulthood. How do you know when you become an adult? To the point where people in their late 20s and early 30s don't necessarily want to identify as being adult. Now, all of this becomes the context for the development of youth ministry, all these different shifts. And so when we think about the rise of youth ministry in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, it really begins to develop out of the schooling, the compulsory schooling, where young people of the same age are congregating together. And so what ended up happening was you had paragroup organizations like Youth for Christ that began to say, well, how do we reach young people? They started to create these associations. So parachurch really just means kind of alongside the church. So these aren't starting in the church. So these are groups like Youth for Christ, Young Life. They model themselves after high school groups. They're segregated by age, and the focus is really relational. We'll see this in Andy Root's book, where the evangelical world decides that they're going to use this idea of relationship and having relationships with people as a way to reach people for Christ. And so these types of associations develop in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They're still around today. But this becomes kind of the groundwork for thinking about youth ministry. Now, emergent adulthood is a phenomenon that's really being emphasized now in practical theology. As we think about not just youth ministry, how can churches minister to young people, thinking in the terms of 13 to 18, now we're talking about 18 to 30, that there's an extended kind of period of emergent adulthood where people are exploring their identity and who they are. It's also seen as a time of instability. They're moving around. They're trying out different jobs. They're not going to settle down in relationships. It becomes very self-focused, kind of trying to figure out, who am I and what is it that I want to do with my life. It's also a time where they feel kind of caught in between. They don't see themselves necessarily as teenagers, but they also don't identify with the adult world. Many people within this age see it as an age of possibility. They got their options set before them. But it's also a time when they put off the markers of adulthood, where they're not settling down and getting married and starting a family right away. Now, what are the three markers that the emergent adults see themselves for adulthood? And this comes out of the work of a guy named Jeffrey Arnett, but also Christian Smith has done some work on emergent adulthood. And these tend to be the three things that this group of people see as this is what makes you an adult. You accept responsibility for yourself, you make independent decisions, and you're financially independent. So you can see independence from parents, monetarily and in other ways, becomes the basis for kind of thinking about what it means to be an adult. So you can see how students who are in college would not necessarily see themselves as adults, even though 18 has traditionally been that time when people would say, well, now you're an adult, because you're still dependent upon your parents or whatever. You're not totally independent at that point. But now increasingly, even after graduating from college, so 22, 23, 24, 25, trying to get a job, trying to become an adult, it's being pushed off some of those different markers that people have used to say, all right, now this is what it means to be an adult. Now, it's important for us, I think, to spend some time talking about identity formation within roughly three different periods. So the pre-modern understanding of this, the modern understanding, and then the postmodern. So in a pre-modern world, your identity really is given. You're born into a family, you're born into a society, a culture, and you just really have to kind of find your way to slip into, this is my role within this structure. And so young people are were expected to live into their identity and to take up those expectations. These are the expectations of the tribe or the clan, the family unit, religious expectations, but also social and economic, taking over family business, being involved in the farm, providing for your family, these types of things. Now, when I talk about this being a pre-modern identity, you can still find this at work in kind of more agricultural areas. It's especially at work in other areas of the world. But even here in the U.S., you can see certain places where there's this pressure to kind of live into a particular identity and expectations of where you're going to live and that you won't move away and those types of things. But this is really a sense in which the purpose of your identity formation and exploration is just to figure out what's the rut in which I got to get in, what's the channel. You find it, and then you go with it. Now, a modern identity, modernity comes along, and what it wants to say is it wants to kind of question the past and cut ourselves off from the past and open up the possibility of newness, of choosing. that your identity is not determined by your family, by where you live. Your identity is something that you can choose. So again, cut off from tradition. There's an emphasis upon freedom and the agency and the ability to make decisions about who you are, to choose a future. And in this, religion and family can actually become more of an obstacle to be overcome. Religious expectations, family expectations. And now education is something then that frees us from tradition. So you can see this today as we think about going off to college. And for many people, the college experience is a time to question what your family has taught you or what your community has taught you, to free you for the possibility of you becoming someone else or choosing your own identity or forming and shaping your own identity. So this modern understanding of identity, I think, is still here, and you can see how young people are kind of wrestling with this. In fact, you could argue that there are some young people who get caught in between this kind of pre-modern notion of identity, wanting to live into family values and live up to their family expectations, but yet there are other areas and places they would like to go, and so they feel stuck or they feel caught. Now, postmodern identity comes along, and it wants to recognize that we're not really quite as free as we thought we were. And so it wants to recognize the role of culture, the role of language, the role of family structures and symbols and metaphors and in shaping and forming kind of who we are. And the fact that I'm an English speaker shapes the way I think about the world, because that language shapes how I see and understand the world. And so I'm not as free as I think I am. And so it wants to recognize how language and these symbols in the world that we inhabit forms and shapes our identity. The purpose of a postmodern identity is to become aware of the ways in which these cultural forms impact us. So are we aware and do we recognize how we have been conditioned by these kind of cultural things? Now, what postmodern identity wants to hold on to from modernity is a sense of the freedom to be able to choose. So while we may not be as free as we think we are at least freed in a way where we can make particular choices. So let me give you an example. My grandmother, who was born in the early 1900s, was part of a family structure in which she became a stay-at-home mom. She did not have a choice in the matter. That was what the expectation was. My wife, when we got married and had children, decided she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. Now, the difference between those two things is that my wife has this awareness of the freedom that she has to work or whatever, but has made the choice to be a stay-at-home mom. My grandma did not have that choice. So in postmodernity, there's a sense in which we still have the freedom to be able to choose how we construct our identity. So I have a picture here of eating local. So when we think about organic food, I mean, if you go back far enough, everything is organic food. It's a struggle to basically produce your own food to feed your family. But now there's a move back to this kind of organic food, but it's a choice that we make. And it's not a struggle. We go to the store, we buy it, or we go to the farmer's market. And so even though you might see some connections between a postmodern identity and a pre-modern identity, the big difference is today we get to choose and select these things. What's also really important for us to recognize today is the emphasis on the self-chosen relationship. And we'll see this in Root's work. And that youth ministry becomes grounded in the self-chosen relationship. So in the pre-modern world, there's a sense in which your family is given to you, and the network of relationships that you're a part of is given to you. Now we live in a modern and postmodern world in which the nuclear family is really the focus of the family in the Western world anyway. And even that is beginning to fragment. And now we're living at a time where we choose our families, that friendship is the most important thing, our self-chosen relationships. And so you see this in the rise of high schools and adolescents and friend groups. So youth ministry, this relational youth ministry, becomes a way of trying to say, how do we break into these friend groups and then have influence over young people. Social media today becomes an example of this kind of self-chosen identity construction. But the important thing to see here is that friendships and networks become essential to who we are, and to the identity that we construct and that we choose for ourselves. Now, from this kind of self-chosen relationship, we're going to move into looking at some of the problems that I think we can find in contemporary Western society, and the impact that it has had upon the way young people form and shape an identity. And that will lead us into discussing some different philosophical perspectives and understandings of this, but will also then prepare us to begin thinking theologically about what does ministry then look like. What I've tried to get you to see is that youth ministry is actually grounded in these shifts of social and cultural situations. And that through this shift, we've developed this form of kind of youth ministry as a parachurch organization focused on relationships and self-chosen families. And what happened then is churches began to be threatened by these things. And so churches began to form youth groups and youth ministry as a way to try to keep young people within the church, but began to use some of the same methods and same focus of these kind of parachurch organizations. And so what we want to do is really begin to unpack what are the issues here at work in the lives of young people, and then theologically, what is youth ministry, or what should be the focus of youth ministry? What can a healthy youth ministry look like within a church setting and within a parachurch setting? But our focus will primarily be thinking about the church setting. So from here, we'll move on to talk about some of those cultural issues, and eventually we'll turn to the theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a way of helping us think through a theology of youth ministry.